The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect the policies and the position of Now You Know.
Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. Together with experts and newsmakers, we make sense of the week's biggest issues and stories. I'm Barnaby Lo in tonight's conversation. China's newly enacted Coast Guard law has raised tensions anew among claimant nations of disputed South China Sea territories. The law empowers members of the Chinese Coast Guard to fire at foreign vessels in waters it claims, which extends to those also claimed by a number of Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines. The Chinese embassy in Manila says it is a domestic law that poses no threat. But just last week, Filipino fisherman Larry Hugo told media he was blocked by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel on his way to one of the sandbars of the Kalayaan group of islands in the West Philippine Sea. The Chinese side has dismissed the story as fake news, while the Philippine military says it's improbable. Lawmakers have urged the executive to take a stronger stance. Foreign Affairs Secretary Teddy Locsin Jr. has lodged a diplomatic protest against the Chinese law. All right, joining us tonight to discuss this West Philippine Sea issue is the director of the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, international maritime law expert, Professor Jay Batongbacal. Good evening, Sir Jay.
Hi, good evening, Barnaby, and all our viewers, listeners. Good evening.
Thank you for coming on the show on a Saturday evening. And we do apologize that Senator Risa Ontiveros is not able to make this show. She has something urgent that just came up a few minutes ago, actually. But we are in no shortage of expertise here. As I mentioned, Professor Jay Batongbacal is our foremost international maritime law expert in the country. So, Professor Jay, let me start out with the statements coming from the Chinese ambassador, which he made in an interview on CNN Philippines yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it yesterday or the other day? I think it was yesterday. First of all, he said that the Chinese Coast Guard law is a domestic law. So I'm going to break down his statements into several different issues. So his first statement is that it is a domestic law. So it has nothing to do with the Philippines. And in fact, he says that it is not targeting any country in the region.
Well, while it is true that it is a domestic law, and if it were under normal circumstances, any nation with a Coast Guard would probably have such a law. The problem with this situation is that we know that China does not limit itself and the application of its law, especially the operations of its Coast Guard, to only their own waters. No? They have this expansive claim, which is illustrated in the 9-dash line that by now most people will be familiar with. And this claim extends into the waters of the Philippines, into the West Philippine Sea, as well as several other Southeast Asian states. And in all of this time, China has been attempting to exercise civilian jurisdiction over this entire area by sending precisely its China Coast Guard to enforce their laws upon our fishermen. So that's why we've had a couple of incidents already. I mean, this year you have two. You have that fisherman who was trying to reach a particular sandbar in the Kalayaan Island group. But also about 2 months ago, you had, or was it a few weeks ago, you had another set of fishermen who were complaining that they were intercepted by the China Coast Guard while they were still on their way to Scarborough Shoal. And their fishing gear was confiscated by the China Coast Guard. And this just follows after several years, since 2016, of many incidents in which our fishermen have been accosted by the China Coast Guard. Well, actually, even some media personalities who were trying to do stories on Scarborough Shoal, they were also accosted by the China Coast Guard and they were basically telling them that they were applying Chinese law to our people. Okay, so the natural conclusion you will reach is that even though this is supposedly a domestic law, they're going to apply it to our people in the West Philippine Sea. So that is
Right,
not
but
acceptable.
isn't it precisely the problem that they consider 90% of the South China Sea as their territory, which would imply that the whole area is domestic territory.
Yes, yes, that's precisely the issue here. So even though they keep saying that it is only a domestic law, their idea of what is a domestic area, what is under their domestic jurisdiction, is very different from ours. And we know that by using this law, they are basically asserting their claim against our own jurisdictions.
So what is the implication of that on our win back in 2016 at The Hague?
Well, yeah, basically it will ignore that win in the same manner that China has ignored the Philippines versus China arbitration award since 2016. So they are just in a way setting the stage for them to continue asserting their excessive claim, this time under legal cover, no, by pointing to their domestic legislation as the basis for their activities in the West Philippine Sea.
But it doesn't diminish the Philippines win?
It does not diminish the Philippines win for as long as the Philippines objects to these actions and objects to the application of Chinese law within Philippine jurisdiction, particularly this type of law, no, which will involve law enforcement jurisdiction concerning things like fisheries, no, which is protected by our WIN, no, our rights to natural resources, no. As long as we do not agree to their or we do not concede that, then the arbitration award will maintain its legal efficacy. But the problem is, if we stay silent, no, if we do not object, and then they start implementing this law within Philippine jurisdiction, well, that would be like a waiver on our part. So that's why we cannot accept this. From the very beginning, our position should be clear that even though they might have valid legislation in China applicable to Chinese waters, those waters do not extend to the West Philippine Sea.
Secretary Locsin was going to stay silent. He was first saying that this was China's domestic issue, which has got nothing to do with us, but he changed his mind. What do you think changed his mind?
Well, I think after considering how China has acted in the past few years, no, even something as apparently innocuous as local legislation becomes problematic in implementation. No? And we know that precisely China's long-term strategy for the South China Sea, the so-called cabbage strategy, precisely tries to take advantage of these innocuous and apparently benign actions, no, but which actions appear to be normal for any other state, but in their implementation actually asserts their claim. What China is trying to do is to make it appear over a long period of time that it is actually exercising civilian jurisdiction over the entire area of the South China Sea within their claim through things such as this, no, legislation, regulation, law enforcement by their Coast Guard, no. So if during that time the Philippines just keeps quiet and then does not object or simply allows its fishermen to be subjected to these law enforcement actions, well, that would be tantamount to acquiescence and eventually a waiver of our rights to these areas. So that's why I think that long-term impact, no, was finally considered, no, after the initial reaction that that's just domestic legislation. After that passed, no, they had realized that no, the longer-term implication of this is much serious.
Okay, so are you satisfied with the action coming from the executive department and in particular the Department of Foreign Affairs?
I'm satisfied with the fact that they have already taken the first step, really, in acting against this legislation. No, a protest on our part is the proper response, really, with the colatilia, no, with the statement that that particular law cannot be made to apply in the West Philippine Sea. I think that would be but proper, no? That's the substance of it, no? That already deters China from using that law as a basis for carrying out law enforcement operations against our people in the West Philippine Sea. But of course, that's not the only step it should take, no? This should be seen as part of a much broader effort, no? That's why I also said that it's not only us who should take this position, but also all the other Southeast Asian countries, no? Because they are just as going to be affected by China's implementation of their Coast Guard law in their waters. And it's not just us here in Southeast Asia, but even in East Asia, particularly I'm thinking of Japan, because in newspaper articles in China about the enactment of this Coast Guard law, reference was made to it being used particularly to advance their claims against Japan, okay? Where their Coast Guard has been intruding increasingly around the areas of the Senkakus, really trying to strain the Japanese, no, who are in that area. So these other nations also should take the same position and express that single unified position to China, that they will never allow China to extend its domestic legislation and its domestic law enforcement against their own people in their own waters.
But should the Philippines go back to The Hague? Secretary Locsin does not want to go back to The Hague, but Secretary Roque had suggested that if there were a case of harassment by the Chinese Coast Guard of Filipino fishermen, that we could go back and file a case in the arbitration court. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we are getting the same suggestion from Justice Carpio.
Well, I think that at this point, since the law was just enacted January 22, and it's only about to take effect, no, we have to really wait until, in a way, the case becomes ripe. Okay, and that means we have to see whether they really will use this legislation to carry out law enforcement activities against Filipinos in the West Philippine Sea. If that happens, then that would be the time that it would be ripe for taking it to the tribunal again.
So you're saying that you don't think that Secretary Locsin is, not open to going back to court at all?
Well, whether or not we go back to the court really is a matter of diplomacy and strategy on the part of the Philippines. So they could use it as a means of creating diplomatic pressure, or even just the threat of going back, no, could also be a source of diplomatic pressure. You have to start, you have to balance this against other means, other modes with which the government is engaging with China. No? So going back to the court immediately usually is not done by other countries, because they try to exhaust all other remedies first. And that includes negotiation, conciliation, fact-finding, etc. Now, since the government's official policy is friendship towards China, I would not expect them to immediately go back to the court. And I would think that based on what they've done before, they would try to take this up in discussions through the bilateral consultation mechanism.
Okay, too early to assess then the Philippine government's diplomatic strategy on this issue. But on the other hand, you saw that story of Larry Hugo in our introduction, and I'm sure you're familiar with his statements and with the video that he had given the media, saying that, binlock daw siya ng Chinese Coast Guard. But then the military is saying this is improbable, and this kind of supports what the Chinese ambassador had said, that this is fake news. Well, I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, it's unfortunate that we are not lending credence to our own people, I think, no? The act of blocking our fishing vessels from navigating in these areas, it's not new. It has happened before, and obviously it's still happening, no? There was only a kind of a relaxation in a way probably between 2016 up to last year, no, that we did not hear as often of those kinds of events. But remember, back in between 2013 to 2016, you even had an incident where the China Coast Guard rammed a Philippine bangka, no, and that basically tore its outriggers. So it's not unusual. Okay, so it's unfortunate that we're not lending credence to that particular incident. There have been other incidents over the past few years that have already been reported up the chain of command of the AFP and up through the channels in government, no. And I think that this particular incident is only another, an additional statistic to what is actually a list of incidents that have been accumulating since 2016.
As far as you're concerned, as far as your knowledge of that area, kasi the military is saying na masyado daw mababaw, it's too shallow for the Chinese Coast Guard to actually go there physically and block the fisherman. The Chinese Coast Guard ship will run aground daw if they do that. So, I mean, what is your understanding of this area?
Well, maybe the problem there in their appreciation or even the presentation of the event, no, is with respect to things like location and time of day, etc. Information which unfortunately we do not have, no. It is possible that that's the case in a specific location in that area. For example, in the areas around Ayungin Shoal, the reason why we were successful in breaking the blockade back in 2014 was that our supply ship was able to make it to the shallow waters where the large China Coast Guard ship could not follow. Okay, so there could be other areas within that large area of the Calayan Island Group where that may be the case, no? But with respect to this particular incident, we simply do not have enough information. One thing I do know, however, is that our Filipino fishermen, they're using much smaller boats than the China Coast Guard, and they are able, therefore, to go into shallower waters. But they are also a lot easier to intimidate, no, by the mere presence of a large China Coast Guard vessel. You have to remember that our bangkas are wooden bangkas, and our fishermen are a long way from home. No, if they're going to see that right in front of them, no, maneuvering right in front of them, is a large China Coast Guard vessel, no, and it's not moving, and it appears to be directly headed towards them, or appears to be maneuvering so that it will set up a collision situation. Then you can understand why our fishermen would say that they are being blocked.
So, in other words, in the absence of complete information, you would rather believe our fishermen?
Yes. I think I would believe them simply because they go there, for months at a time. I mean, it's their lives. Okay? And they would already have a sense, no, of not only the waves and the weather, but also about ships and their intentions. They would have that sense already. They know when a ship is trying to ram them. They will know when a ship is trying to intimidate or harass them or trying to block them and prevent them from proceeding in the direction that they are trying to proceed.
Okay, so just the mere act of intimidation, but the Chinese ambassador said that he assures that the Chinese Coast Guard won't use, and these are his words, strong measure against fishermen. What do you make of this statement? Would you take his word for it?
What does he mean by a strong measure? Okay, is a strong measure firing upon them with a 5-inch gun? Is the use of small firearms a strong measure? Remember, prior to this, we have already had incidents where our fishermen were blasted with water cannon. We've had incidents where our fishermen were surrounded by armed men with long arms, with rifles, and probably assault weapons circling around them. I mean, do you need to wait for so-called strong measures? How strong, quote unquote, are these measures supposed to be? No? Before our
The
fishermen
point
who
he was
are
making,
unarmed and alone out there, before they are intimidated.
the point he was making, and just to be the devil's advocate here, the point he was making was that China has never fired upon any fishermen in the region.
It has not fired upon any fishermen that we know. We have had reports of warning shots, of course, but we do know that they have blasted other boats with water cannons. We do know that they have sunk other fishing vessels, especially in Vietnam, for example. We do know that they ram smaller boats, and they use the size of their vessels to really intimidate smaller fishermen and boats. No? So I don't think it's really just a matter of using weapons, no, or firing upon them. It's the entire conduct, really, of the China Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy on this point.
Those do sound like strong measures. Ramming
And that's the thing.
and water cannons. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I was,
So,
I was
you may not fire the shot, but you've already sunk several vessels simply by ramming them.
Yeah, I was near Subi Reef back in 2015, and together with Filipino fishermen, and they were already constructing their artificial island on Subi Reef, and they already had the tower. And then, you know, when we were getting closer and closer, they were flashing a light on us. And you know, the fishermen we were with, the fear was real, and there wasn't even a Coast Guard ship that was coming straight to us or anything like that. It was just the light coming from the tower, from the artificial island.
Yes, because the fishermen don't know what will come next. Okay, I mean,
Yeah,
that's the kind of non-strong measures that they are encountering. Huh?
yeah, and the mayor himself, Mayor Roberto Del Mundo, saying na umiwas muna tayo. I mean, is this a good statement coming from the mayor of the Kalayaan group of islands?
Yeah. Well,
I know he's trying to
yeah, I know he's
protect the fishermen as well, you know, and trying to
protect his people.
prevent tensions and violence, you know. But
Yes.
on the other hand, it's like surrendering.
Yes, that is understandable. No, after all, they are very far away. Government help is far away, and in most cases, very little. No, compared to the amount of the number of ships and the amount of force that China could bring to bear on them. No, and that is indeed a bad situation. No. Unfortunately, it also falls into China's trap, no, into the strategy that China is using. What China wants is for the smaller countries like the Philippines and the other nations around us to voluntarily leave this area, to voluntarily abandon their claims. So all of these activities, all of these actions they've taken, trying to build up their force, trying to make themselves look intimidating, trying to putting up these bases, military bases right there in the middle, and then increasing the activity of their law enforcement and military and paramilitary forces. That is all precisely intended to scare people away so that they will voluntarily leave the area. No? And unless we do keep, giving assurances to our people that they will be protected, or at least standing up to this kind of these attempts at intimidation, then unfortunately, eventually that they might succeed. No, if we keep thinking that no, we should always avoid trouble, we should always try to keep things quiet. That's exactly what China wants.
Yeah, I hope my understanding is wrong or my interpretation is wrong, but the mayor seemed to have insinuated that this is advice coming from the military, from the top.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. After all, the military also does not want to start a conflict in that area. They know that they're in a disadvantaged position. Okay? But unfortunately, I think we're not really thinking over the long term about the impact of this. No, Back in the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s, a colleague of mine, the late Professor Baviera, and I did a study in that, for the Calayan Island Group. No? And even back in the 1990s, one thing that we noticed was that the Philippine fishing activities were spread all over the Calayan Island Group area in the early 70s. It's as if we were the only ones fishing in that area. And the fishermen said that they had only, scattered sightings of a few Chinese fishermen, maybe from Hong Kong or Taiwan. They could recognize the vessels, no? But by the 1980s, in terms of the areas, the Philippine fishing activities, Philippine fishing grounds, they had essentially retreated, no? Retreated towards Palawan, while the rest of the Calayan Island Group was now more often fished by these other countries, particularly China. Okay, so when we asked them why, it was because, according to them, there was an incident, no, which involved a Philippine fishing vessel. And they were advised back then to avoid trouble, no, basically, and to just fish elsewhere. Okay, so that's exactly the same attitude, no, I think. No, it's the same before, it's the same now. And so what's happening is that we are essentially ceding ground to these other countries, particularly to China, simply because we want to avoid trouble. Okay, and I think China knows that, and that's why now they're really increasing all of their efforts, no, to scare us out of our own areas.
Okay, so this ceding, this retreating, is this why we are seeing a number of Chinese dredging vessels, a couple of Chinese survey ships intrude into the Philippines EEZ?
No, well, with respect to the dredging vessels and marine scientific research vessels, that's a different issue. That's a different activity, and they're fairly recent as well. No? With the fishing, this overall trend has been there since the 1970s. But marine scientific research and these dredging activities, these are practically only within the last decade. Okay. Particularly 2012, 2013, around that time. Okay. The marine scientific research activities, in particular, there was a surge in marine scientific research activities by the Chinese in the West Philippine Sea after 2016. Okay. Before that, it was minimal. There were attempts, but they did not conduct these cruises as far as we know. But between 2016, January, and December 2017, you had a surge of these activities where Chinese vessels were practically all over West Philippine Sea. They were found in the Spratlys, they're around Scarborough, they're along the Luzon coast. No? And then afterwards, in 2018, onwards, we saw that they began, basically the activities began moving elsewhere, up north and to the Pacific side of the Philippines. Okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's relatively new. That one I would attribute to the government's, precisely it's the government's friendly policy towards China after 2016. Because if you remember, the first time it came up, when it was revealed by Secretary Lorenzana himself that this vessel, this marine scientific research vessel was observed along Benam Rise, the president came out with a statement saying that he was allowing all of this. Okay? So I guess because of that, whether it's an actual agreement or what, no, it's because of that that the Chinese research vessels began conducting their activities freely within the West Philippine Sea.
And this latest one, though, this latest one, though, the Chinese embassy insists just took shelter and that it had permission from the DFA, but Coast Guard saying that there was no weather disturbance at the time.
Well, that's the thing. The vessel itself, when you look at the movement, the track, it appears that it really was conducting some kind of marine scientific research cruise in the middle of the Pacific. And I suspect that it was in line with their multi-year project to observe the ocean in that area. No? They have their own national project on that, and there's also another international research project that involves that. So it's one or the other, and the ship is probably participating in that. The thing is, when it came to shelter in the Philippines, it was already docked in our waters by the time that it asked for permission. And this vessel also happens to have a record of previous intrusions. No, I mean, last year it was one of the vessels that was identified by the Philippine Navy, no, as being among the ships that were in the West Philippine Sea. Some of them were even conducting surveys. Okay, so that naturally raises a bell, no, an alarm bell as to what this vessel is doing. Suddenly, all of a sudden, it's already anchored in Catanduanes. So the concern is legitimate because it has a previous record of unauthorized conduct in our waters. No? So even if it may be true that they sought shelter, even if it may be true that they were avoiding sea conditions or weather conditions, no, that does not prevent us. No, that should not prevent us from being, on our guard every time this vessel enters the Philippine EEZ. Okay, it might be just passing through. That's fine. No, but if you're going to do that, you should at least have the diplomatic courtesy of informing the government beforehand. No, before you actually enter. I mean, what's the point of the notice if you're already there? No?
Right. So you're saying that there wasn't prior notice to the Philippine government, but what about the dredging ships, the dredging vessels?
The dredging ship is a different. Yeah. That's a different problem now because that one is more of a domestic issue. For some years now, there have been reports of illegal dredging activities, no, in Samar and in Cagayan. In areas there are known deposits of what is called iron sand or black sand, no? And these ships just come in and take all of this sand, no, under the guise of dredging by the local government, etc. And then they ship it away. Okay? Black sand is actually a valuable mineral resource. Black sand is iron. And it is a particular type of iron which is easy to magnetize. It is what is used to make hard disk drives and flash drives, which are, ubiquitous and basic components now of all computers. Okay, so there has been a lot of illegal black sand mining going on using these types of ships. And this particular ship that was cited, I think, Bataan, no? I think it just so happened that it caught the attention of the local people, no? And it was reported. Okay?
Otherwise, they have been operating here without hitches, without problems.
Yes. But for sure, there have been other instances, and there have been other ships. No? Now, this particular ship, when the government looked into its history, it found out that actually it had a permit to do some activities that a year ago, but it had expired. So it was supposed to have already left, but no, it is still around, no, and undertaking its activities. So this one is a problem of domestic regulation and law enforcement. We do not seem to have a good way of tracking these foreign vessels that are contracted for some local work, no, or we do not have a system of actually screening the vessels that the foreign vessels that come into our waters to do any kind of activity.
Pero ito na nga, the Chinese embassy saying na this latest issue of that dredging vessel is not the Chinese registered vessel. It's under the flag of Sierra Leone.
Yeah, that's splitting hairs, I think, no, because the flag of Sierra Leone is what is known as a flag of convenience. What does that mean? It's a country which has very lax standards, such that any ship from any country can register the vessel there. Okay, this is a practice in the shipping industry, especially for the shady companies who just want to avoid things like taxes and regulations in their home countries. So they register it, get the vessel flagged in another country. So Sierra Leone is one of them. It's one of those identified flags of convenience. But the vessel, its design is Chinese. No? I mean, there aren't that many dredging vessels in the world, and the most common ones happen to be the Chinese vessels. And if the crew and the owner of this vessel are also Chinese companies, then the flag is, that's just superficial evidence.
Cambodian daw yung crew that were found.
You can even employ Cambodian crew now. What you need to trace is the ownership.
Okay, the Coast Guard actually saying that the ownership has been traced to a company that's registered in Shanghai, but the Chinese embassy saying that's not true. And the Chinese embassy goes further in saying that, let me just read it. Everyone is entitled to freedom of speech. However, malicious, hyped up, irresponsible, and baseless accusations that run counter to common sense are not acceptable. I'm not saying that the Chinese embassy is saying this to you, but I think just in general to people criticizing their Chinese Coast Guard law, as well as the presence of Chinese ships in the Philippines. What is your comment on this?
Well, perhaps with respect to the Chinese vessel, that may be applicable. No? But you cannot fault the people either from having these concerns because they already have prior experiences. There have already been prior incidents of these kinds of activities. No? With respect to the China Coast Guard law, you have all of the prior incidents where the China Coast Guard interacted with our people in the West Philippine Sea. No? Most of them bad experiences. Now, there are a few good ones, yes, but there have been a lot of bad experiences. And it is our fishermen that are complaining down. They're running out of fishing grounds and livelihoods. So you cannot fault them for that. With respect to the dredging vessels, here you have huge concerns over everything from environment to the illegal extraction of mineral resources, to the damage to communities. No? So they have reason to have these kinds of suspicions, have these kinds of concerns.
Okay, just going back to the Chinese Coast Guard law, another point that the Chinese ambassador made is that other countries have had Coast Guard laws for years already. And in fact, the Philippines has had a Coast Guard law since 2009. And our Coast Guard personnel are armed. But what for you would be the main differences between our own Coast Guard law and the Chinese Coast Guard law in terms of what is written in the laws and in terms of actual practical implementation?
I think in terms of what's written, I mean, there's no real issue, shall we say, in the sense that it does try to address the kinds of problems, issues, and activities that Coast Guards usually deal with. Okay, so if you just read it on its own, isolated from everything else, then it seems okay. But the problem now is implementation. We know that they will not limit it to only the Chinese side of the South China Sea. They will use that law to justify activities on the West Philippine Sea. That will happen. We're sure of it that that's going to happen. Second, unlike our Coast Guard, our Coast Guard and under the Coast Guard law, it is a clearly civilian agency which is placed under the direction of the Department of Transportation. Okay? Its functions are clearly civilian. The Chinese Coast Guard is not. The Chinese Coast Guard functions under the Central Military Commission, which also directs the People's Liberation Navy and People's Liberation Army Air Force. So it is a military service. Okay? And it also happens to have the biggest, absolutely biggest Coast Guard vessels you've ever seen anywhere in the world. Their ships are former Navy ships that they just took out of the naval service and reduced the weaponry and then painted white. They are Navy ships. Okay? So, and they're building them in massive numbers. Okay? So it's not just the law itself that you should look at, it's also how they use them. Okay? And I'm saying really that, this law is basically another part of the cabbage strategy that they're implementing to get the Southeast Asian countries to simply give up on their respective waters in the South China Sea.
I guess in terms of the area where this is going to be implemented, right? I mean, they're going to implement this in principle in 90% of the South China Sea. But the Philippine Coast Guard only implements this in the West Philippine Sea.
Yes. Yeah.
Am I right?
And yes, and when you also look at it, the Philippine Coast Guard basically implements the law in accordance with mandates under our domestic law, which are consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So we're talking about EEZ enforcement, okay, meaning only our natural resource rights. China does not make such distinctions because it claims the entire South China Sea to be its territory under historic title or rights or some kind of historic claim. And it has taken actions, it has undertaken activities which are more consistent with a state that is exercising full sovereignty over this area, not mere sovereign rights, not mere natural resource rights, but full sovereignty.
And how badly do you think this can end? I mean, some people saying with this, it could end in a shooting war if there would be some miscalculations at sea. Is that something that you think is possible?
Well, of course, it's possible in any scenario. No? The thing is, with the China Coast Guard basically now being expressly authorized to use force, it's in the legislation that they can actually use, forcefully evict, forcefully dismantle, etc., etc. The fact that they now have that authority at the local level makes the risk even higher. The possibility of an incident is even greater now. Because before, such kinds of activities had to be cleared by the central government in Beijing. Now they've downloaded it to the commanders. Okay, so that is a very dangerous move. When you allow just the local commanders to decide whether or not he will use force against our vessels, and he has full authority to do so under their legislation. It's even our own Coast Guard has already encountered such problems. Remember, there was an incident off Balintang Channel in 2014. 2014, I think, yeah. And that already caused a major international incident. And that was in our waters. That incident that took place undisputably within the Philippine EEZ. Here, what you have is the possibility that will take place in the West Philippine Sea, where China in the first place has no legitimate right to undertake that kind of law enforcement. So if there was ever going to be a casus belli, as it's called, a cause of war, cause of a conflict, that would be it, I think. And that's why we have to be very careful. That's why we also have to be very firm in telling China not to implement that law on our side, on the West Philippine, in the West Philippine Sea.
Okay, finally then, would the U.S. role in the South China Sea help this situation or worsen the tensions, you think? Especially given that the new Secretary of State has already publicly stated his support for the Philippines arbitration win.
I think that is a very important move. It reinforces the legitimacy of our position. It very clearly defines or determines who could be right or wrong in case there is an incident in the West Philippine Sea and it involves an issue where jurisdiction is invoked, or legitimacy is at stake. So that firmly establishes that the United States, as well as many other countries, are supporting the Philippine position, are reinforcing the Philippines' legal rights in that area. And hopefully that will be enough to deter China.
And so you support the U.S. Navy's freedom of navigation operations?
I support it in the sense that it is one of the activities that keeps China from operating freely in the West Philippine Sea up to our 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Okay? that keeps them on their toes, that keeps them from undertaking any activity that is excessively provocative, no, or would be unduly damaging to us. No? Nonetheless, however, I can understand that there is also always that risk, no, that it raises tensions, no. But then that is now something that the Philippines and the U.S. should be more closely discussing, no, should be more closely coordinated on. It's precisely the kind of thing that they should be working on through the alliance relationship. Our problem has always been that we don't seem to have an appreciation of alliance relationships and how we're supposed to use it and how we're supposed to manage it. It's always been the same old story where we rely on the U.S. to fight our battles for us. That is a wrong attitude. No? In the same way here, no, that kind of attitude is what colors people's misunderstanding of these phone-ops. It just simply, they just simply dismiss it as the U.S. Only pursuing its interests without regard for our own. No, well, that's the problem. You're not supposed to do that, and you're supposed to discuss and coordinate with the U.S. these kinds of actions. So the phone-ops, for them to be really effective, no, we also need to be able to coordinate our actions and policies with the actions and policies of the United States. After all, we're allies, okay? And through that, we're supposed to be protecting our mutual interests. No? There are interests that are mutual and reinforcing. There are interests that are necessarily separate, but the alliance is about the mutual interests, the things that we have in common with each other. That's what we should work on.
All right, one final question, I promise. How does this Chinese Coast Guard law affect the negotiations for the Code of Conduct, which has gone on forever?
It definitely presents a new problem. Okay, in the first place, the Code of Conduct discussions had already been stymied by the COVID-19 pandemic. No, they were unable to meet for over a year now because of that. And the kinds of issues, the kinds of things that they're trying to cover in the Code of Conduct would include things like this, no? How law enforcement is supposed to be carried, how their law enforcement forces are supposed to act, comport themselves when at sea. Well, this law makes it even more difficult to discuss that particular issue if it is included in the Code of Conduct, that list of items in the Code of Conduct. Naturally, the other countries will have that same concern that China will use it against them in their waters. So it only establishes, or it only creates an unnecessary stumbling block, I think, for the Code of Conduct discussions. Some of that may be removed. Maybe that will be removed if China gives that assurance or makes that commitment not to apply it in their waters. No, but we shall have to wait and see.
Yeah. All right. Lots of ongoing problems and now new problems with regards to the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Jay Batongbacal, on this Saturday evening. Thank you, everyone, for watching Viewpoint. Do catch us live every Saturday at 6 in the evening on Now You Know's Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages. For updates on our upcoming episodes, please join our Facebook group. Just search for Viewpoint with Barnaby Lo. Again, I just said it. My name is Barnaby Lo. This is Viewpoint. Now you know.